Hey, my name is Thiago Falcão. I'm a professor working at the Federal University of Paraíba in Brazil, and I'm here today to talk about the Brazilian scene of esports. So I prepared uh, a lecture. I'll read it, and I apologize if I'm not looking at the camera, but it's a confusing situation. So let's do it. Um, Esports in Brazil playing against all odds. Esports in Brazil is a thriving field, despite the insufficient resources provided by the major institutional actors involved in the practice, the Brazilian state, and the corporations that manage and profit from it. Discussing the state of affairs of esports in Brazil is paramount because its social and political characteristics offer subtleties rarely present in esports elsewhere. Namely, Brazil brings forth an entanglement of material conditions that help define not only the metagame practices as they should, but the very social aspect of who is playing, or, to put it differently, who is allowed to play what games. It is not solely a matter of commercial dynamics, it has to do with the social dynamics outlining the country's whole experience of esports. Esports in Brazil is a cultural arena rich with dissonant discourses and stories of prejudice and precariousness, and powerful accounts of resistance and solidarity. The activity earns millions of dollars per year, and recently it has been more enticing to the youth than soccer itself. Soccer is a big hit in Brazil. This comprehension is supported by an epistemological stance that encompasses academic scholarship, commercial actions, and my insertion as a researcher and consumer of these products since my childhood. In this lecture, I will provide a general overview of the scene's general organization and what led it to its state of affairs. I will offer some background to the phenomenon that will allow us to understand what forces underlie the practice and how they help shape the scene. I will also discuss how research on the theme is being developed in Brazil because observing this theme will reveal several infrastructural questions that will help understand the Brazilian esports scene and the general context in which it stands. So understanding Brazil is also important to me. If we think about esports, many of the themes that come to mind are related to teams, casters, and companies. Maybe you have heard of MIBR, it's MIBR, we call it MIBR, made in Brazil, PEN, and Flamengo, some of our most prominent teams, Gaules, one of our most famous streamers, and how Garena's Free Fire is one of the top grossing games in the country, eventually surpassing League of Legends and Counter-Strike Global Offensive. These are naturally significant representations of how Brazil's esports is thriving. But if I'm being honest, these are not faithful representations of how the scene is stratified. This lecture aims to illustrate how this infrastructure of winner personas and glimmering spectacle depends upon a network of precariousness, informality, dissent, and exploitation. Like many other countries under the aegis of the concept of Global South, Brazil has a turbulent political history, from coup attempts to actual coups, from totalitarian periods to the rise of the nationalist far right. These periods in our history left a considerable impression. Even today, we can identify the influence of the material arrangements that were the byproduct of this traumatic process. Of all places, this process is visible in the esports scene. At this point, you may wonder why I digress so strongly from the lecture's central subject, bringing up the country's political situation, as if it would help us understand the particularities of our game culture. As a matter of fact, it does. The country's recent military past was instrumental in shaping up video games experience as we know it. More than that, understanding this social and political dimension of Brazil will undoubtedly help us grasp the role video games occupy in the country's everyday culture, highlighting the importance of understanding leisure and play as key concepts that help analyze and address society. That said, I have structured this lecture on three topics, each addressing an essential aspect of Brazilian video games culture. These topics are, respectively, named Video Games in Brazil, History and Context, Brazilian Esports, Current State of Affairs, and finally, Esports Research in Brazil, Overview and Agenda. The first topic offers an understanding of how Brazilian politics guided the acquisition of informatics equipment in the country and how policies from the 1970s at the same time enabled and constrained the video games industry in Brazil. I intend to provide a background discussion of the culture that allowed video games to flourish in Brazil in the early 1980s. Following up on the second topic, I will discuss the current state of affairs of esports in Brazil with some specificities that will help understand how the phenomenon has been taking shape in the country through the last 2 decades. From LAN houses, local area network houses, running Counter-Strike 1.4 to the Brazilian Championship of League of Legends, we call it CBLOL. There are many opportunities for researchers in order to engage with this scene. This topic's main objective is to illustrate the context with some history. I try to discuss how the material dimensions and symbolic conditions that coalesce into the Brazilian esports culture are a byproduct of individual agency, corporate governance of said platforms, and these social structures in place since the military government's days. Finally, in the last topic, I will present a brief discussion about the relationship between Brazilian academia and esports research. The field still has much to grow and faces many obstacles. From outside academia, there is a problem of funding, both public and private, and from within academia, esports research has little or no resonance. By the end, I hope I will have painted a picture that ably conveys what the commercial and subjective articulations of esports in Brazil look like, highlighting my special attention to multiple relations of precariousness and exploitation. I hope that this lecture will adequately illustrate how Brazil's esports scene is not only about teams and players, or marketing and commercial possibilities, but also about grasping this precarious context represented in the country's social implications and structural problems. Before directly addressing how video games came to be in Brazil, I feel like I should offer some background to clarify some of the points I will address further. Brazil is the largest country in both South America and Latin America. It has an immense territory of 8.5 million square kilometers and over 211 million people. Much like in many other countries globally, the Brazilian population struggles with the centralization of its technological infrastructure. And this is a problem that directly impacts the esports scene. Brazilian game scholar Tarcísio Macedo has been documenting, for one, the relationship between different regions of the country with specific attention to esports teams in the northern region. One of his main arguments, for example, illustrates how a team cannot reach a competitive level of professionalism in Brazil's peripheral regions because of said infrastructure. This condition does not merely represent the social inequality for which Brazil is known worldwide. Yes, poverty certainly plays a part in this equation, as we will see. But there is something else here, something more profound. This inequality is related to the very history of how Brazil was created, colonized by many European countries, and exploited on many accounts of its natural resources. As a matter of fact, the hypothesis I have been currently working on in my research posits that neoliberal dynamics have captured the very essence of play and leisure. But not only that, I also suggest that this capture is particularly effective in countries that are unequipped with the welfare structure so familiar to the actual Western world, in detriment to the countries of the global South, where we stand. Although these topics may not seem related, it is a fact that the military dictatorship under which Brazil lived between 1964 and 1985 was instrumental in the way computers developed in the country and, consequently, video games. A widespread argument in the Brazilian academic community during the 1970s was that the country should make a strategic move that would dissipate technological dependence on other countries. The idea was simple. If Brazil became more dependent on computers and could not produce them, it would have to pay any price for these products. In 1977, the military regime adopted a market reserve policy to boost the Brazilian economy by developing national technology companies. This policy intended to promote Brazilian technological development so that the country would be less dependent on foreign technology, especially from the USA. In 1984, the government put the market reserve policy under review and transformed it into Federal Law number 7232, nicknamed the Law of Informatics. The Brazilian government revoked the market reserve policy in October 1991 when the country was undergoing the so-called market opening process. 2 points are important here. The first, more prominent, concerns the moment in which the market reserve policy became effective. The second, its practical effect in the field of video games. Brazil implemented the market reserve policy when trade between countries was considerably more complicated than it would have been in the late 1980s. The rise of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's neoliberal politics during the 1980s gradually undermined the power of the Brazilian state. But by the beginning of the 1980s, that power was still manifesting itself in a very preponderant way. The market reserve policy imposed barriers to the rise and spread of Brazilian computer culture at that time. Such a context did not prevent, though, video games from finding their alternative path. In 1983, while the United States was experiencing its famous crash in the video games industry, the story was slightly different in Brazil. Until the early 1980s, video games were practically unknown in Brazil. Under the aegis of the market reserve policy, the industry could not import components or video game consoles to complicate the picture further. The defining moment for the video game culture in Brazil happened in this perfect storm. As the proper distribution of Atari 2600 was impossible in the country, some companies had to develop a solution, quote unquote, to the problem. This solution, so-called solution, was to bring some consoles from the US and have the engineers in these companies to work on reverse engineering them. The first Atari 2600 clone released in Brazil was the CX2600, manufactured by a company called Atari Eletrônica Limitada, which has the same name as American Atari. Atari Eletrônica released the CX2600 in 1980, just 3 years after Atari's launch in the USA. Simultaneously, other small electronic companies were already producing cartridges for this and other pirated consoles reaching the market. This condition was responsible for jump-starting Brazil's gamer culture approximately a decade before what would have been expected if we depended on the legal importations as happened later. The context of piracy and cloning frames video games consumption in Brazil since its beginning and quite frankly inspires its culture. Piracy in Brazil is a very common phenomenon, and it's largely disseminated in, for example, Facebook or Twitter, forums, groups, and so on and so forth. For example, I grew up in the 1980s and never played the original Atari 2600 Enduro, a hit in Brazil. I only played copies of it. As a matter of fact, I cannot know which games I played as a child were clones or originals. That was the state of the phenomenon. Several video games have undergone this process. During the 1980s, for example, it was not uncommon to find Street Fighter 6, 7, or even 8 in the arcades, pirated, altered versions that transformed the game, offering a character of unpredictability but also so much fun. It turns out that most of these hacks were not even Brazilian, but it was amusing to switch characters in fight or use different powers with unpredictable consequences. It is possible to say that the piracy and cloning of video games were present in the development of the national video game scene since its formation, guiding it throughout the 1980s. The 1990s came with a series of transformations in the institutional aspects of Brazil. The military regime fell in 1985 and the country published and served a new constitution in 1988. Brazil's borders were already open, and by then the industry was also able to expand and establish a dialogue with the world abroad. In 1991, the market reserve policy was revoked and neoliberal policies began flourishing in Brazil for good. This period witnessed a wave of privatizations and foreign capital entry into the country. This period also saw the arrival of emblematic consoles such as Nintendo's Super Nintendo Entertainment System and Sega's Master System. The beginning of 1990s concentrated the distribution of many of these consoles. So we have Genesis, which was marketed in Brazil with the name Sega Genesis, with the name of Mega Drive. Master System, which was marketed by Tectoy, the same company that later produced the Zibo console, the first Brazilian console, and a bunch of Nintendo original and ripoffs. We marketed the NES, the Nintendo Entertainment System, as Phantom System in Brazil. So there were lots of video game consoles in Brazil in that time, in that era. However, the proper arrival of computers in Brazil did not address a problem that exists to this day: the relationship between the country's endemic poverty and the high cost of technology in general, especially what is considered non-essential technology, such as video game consoles. Even if video games were now accessible, this did not mean they were affordable. Only a small fraction of the population could afford to have a console home. Seeing how exclusive consoles were, many rental stores diversified their services by renting cartridges and creating space where at the same time renting cartridges and creating space where the kids who did not have consoles could rent them, the consoles, for some time and play the games as if they properly actually owned a console. This peculiar phenomenon was responsible for creating sociability spaces for children and young people that were very different from arcades, since they were almost always home spaces adapted to receive 1 or 2 dozen children at the same time on a Saturday morning. They actually functioned through the week, but Saturday morning was the big hit of these rental stores. Of course, an appropriation also creates problems. In these rental stores, the main issue was the relationship between private property and public use. Not only was the practice frowned upon by the personalities in the industry and retail sectors, but for the players, it also had its hiccups. Say you bought half an hour and ventured into a JRPG, and then saved your progress in a cartridge. Neither the time spent there would be satisfactory, nor the save file would be safe. Imagine you buy 30 minutes to play, I don't know, Phantasy Star, and it's an 80-hour game. And then you save your progress in the game and the next player erases it. It was a very common thing to happen. But there were other problems. Sometimes you wanted to play in the Super Nintendo, but people would have reserved the console throughout the day. Without the aid of paratexts, magazines, and such, the regular player had to bet which games would be to his liking. It was tough. It is intriguing to note that unlike the arcade dynamics, public, competitive, in a rental store like these, a player was free to enjoy his time as he wanted without interruptions. This experience then was sought by players who did not want to venture into the hostile space of arcade competition and fighting games. In these rental stores, a player did not rent the cartridge, but the experience of having its own console. The situation leads to two specific constructions. First, a comment about arcades and fighting games, then a comment about the age group of the players in these rental stores. The experience of arcades and fighting games in Brazil is particularly appealing because it illustrates the idea of class struggle very well. On one side, there were arcades adorned with lights, air hockey tables, pool tables, and many, many games in customized cabinets, usually placed in shopping malls. Those were practically, these arcades were practically daycare centers where parents left their children while they shopped or strolled through the mall. On the other side, in the city's outskirts, precarious garages with electricity hacks, we call them gambiarras, housed 1 or 2 less than pristine cabinets in a precarious state. These would generally run an SNK or Capcom fighting game. The players that surrounded these, all of them from low peripheral regions with many structural problems, often would only have money for the soul coin, and they needed to make it count. It is no surprise, then, how competitive, even toxic, these spaces were. The experience in these scenarios would be akin to gambling. The prospect of defeat put too much at stake. The rental stores transformed this phenomenon, offering a sort of protection to players in this vulnerable condition. These spaces welcomed the player not accomplished enough, which could not enter the arcade's competitive space for any reason. He, most rarely she, simply paid for the time and played alone with a friend or a sibling. The player rented the console and the TV set, cocooning himself in an experience that, although social, definitely social, by the structure of these places, was much more personal than the experience of arcades. The second comment about the age group comes exactly in this wake. Considering this condition, it is not surprising that children often attended these rental stores, which were much more welcoming than the arcades space. So the arcades were a teenager thing, the especially the peripheral arcades, the precarious arcades. They were a teenager thing. They were borderline toxic. We didn't used to have, I don't know, posters of any kind of decoration. It was a plain garage with bad painting, and it was a really precarious scene. Directly in opposition to this, there were these rental stores where the kids, the little kids, they used to go. Their parents used to drop them there and pay for 2-3 hours, and it wasn't really uncommon to see, well, really young players in these spaces. I don't know, 7, 8 years old, playing video games in a huge group of people. These rental stores eventually gave way to the spaces we call LAN houses in Brazil, LAN from local area network. In the absence of broadband internet at the end of the 1990s, these spaces dependent on local network technology replaced the arcades and rental stores on a large scale, attracting real crowds of teenagers, primarily males, to their premises. LAN houses consisted of a particularly intriguing phenomenon because the way they functioned combined the forms of consumption discussed earlier. On the one hand, the consumption dynamics were similar to those of the rental stores. You paid for time and enjoyed the game as you wanted. On the other hand, the open and fierce competition was present again. At LAN houses, these groups of teenagers would form teams and compete against each other in historically significant games. StarCraft, Counter-Strike 1.4, Warcraft 3, and other games. This leap between casual gaming and articulated competition, though, was not easy. It involved social finesse, a sort of social finesse necessary to abandon inconsequent single-player gaming and form a competitive team. We are discussing competition, surely, but we are also discussing group formation with crystal clear group objectives. At the end of the 1990s and beginning of the 2000s, this moment was crucial for developing Brazil's esports scenario. It was then that some of the clans emerged that would become the esports teams of today. More specifically, it was then that the spirit of organized competition developed in Brazil. Perhaps the most famous of these clans is Made in Brazil, the MIBR, which emerged in 2003 and ended its activities in 2012. Made in Brazil was founded in 2003 in Rio de Janeiro when businessman Paulo Veloso decided to invest in the Counter-Strike team of his son, Rafael Veloso, Fred. Veloso's investment raised the team's level and led it to become the best team in Brazil, attracting the world's attention to Brazilian Counter-Strike. It consolidated the country as one of the powers of electronic sports. becoming the only Brazilian team to win the Electronic Sports World Cup in 2006. MIBR also won essential titles such as Chopin 2007, DreamHack Winter 2007, and Game Bune 2008. The case of MIBR is interesting because it illustrates the extent of the business models available in this first moment of esports in Brazil. There were no sponsorship investments or marketing infrastructures positioned to absorb this type of activity in the beginning of the 2000s. Not even considering that MIBR made international fame, winning titles. The local media, in general, focused on video games as if they were mere toys that served to entertain late children and adolescents. There was talk about MIBR returning to the spotlight in 2016. However, Paulo Veloso firmly rebuked the rumors by saying that the team would only return, quote, when it was possible to predict costs and revenues, end quote. In 2018, the MIBR brand was acquired by the American esports organization Immortals, currently known as Immortals Gaming Club, and today it occupies a place of reference within the esports scenario in Brazil and the world. Besides outlining the organization of the competitive scenario that would be adopted, the question about LAN houses also pointed out real problems of possible business models at the time. Mass media was still not interested in covering competitive video games, which meant no marketing investment. The profit for being a sort of professional player came exclusively from winning unsponsored championships, which was, as one may infer, hard work. Naturally, only kids who came from very wealthy backgrounds were able to take these attempts at stardom. Many of the photos from that era, I have a bunch, reveal swaths of white kids huddled together with customized t-shirts, dreaming of a time they would definitely not experience. However, the general perception of mass media was that video games were still child's play that should not be treated seriously. LAN houses were crucial for the video game scene in Brazil. They offered the necessary spaces for articulating essential groups in the proliferation of the practice, and for a long time, they were responsible for spreading the gamer culture in the country. This moment witnessed the emergence of the phenomenon of celebrities in video games. Players and teams gained prominence, traveling to tournaments in nearby cities or seeking sponsors who would usually respond to these requests with mistrust. Brazil still was not ready to welcome video games and turn them into esports in the 2000s. In the LAN houses, however, the competition scenario was fierce. They functioned as a subculture with its particular dynamics, hierarchies, and values. Of course, playing had become accessible, but economic conditions were still broadly defining success in competition. As Brazilian broadband was still not reliable in the mid-2000s, as it still is not in some locations to this day, I'll get to that later. Those who effectively wanted to compete attended LAN houses in a very typical way, paying a lot for the computer rental and often taking with them their own mouse and keyboard, so they would not be exposed to broken mouses and keyboards. And this sort of became the fashion. You had your own fancy keyboard you took to these LAN houses. This scenario, although incipient, already demonstrated dimensions of appropriations enabled by the financial conditions of players. It is impossible to think about LAN houses in Brazil without thinking about Counter-Strike. Sure, we were playing something of Warcraft 3 at the moment, and I'm thinking a moment before Defense of the Ancients, Dota. But the game that moved those spaces was CS. Whether it was version 1.4 or the more stable 1.6, CS was the first game to propel teams and tournaments systematically. No wonder this was and still is one of the best received games in the Brazilian public. Not only CS has had fewer hardware requirements for a moment where computers were still developing, but the creation of the map called CS Rio was the necessary push to draw a whole culture around the game. Aztec and dust gave way to the steeps and slums of Rio de Janeiro, with emblematic stereotypical details, soccer, samba, and soap operas. The map was successful as soon as it was released, with 6,000 downloads in the first week and 24,000 in the second. Set in a fictitious favela in Rio de Janeiro, the map was a hit among players because of its unusual features, such as funk and samba playing on the radios, and a soccer field where you could kick a ball. So you could kinda play soccer in this map. CS Rio called into question several conditions present in the Brazilian social experience. The imagery of favela was transported to a world of images that were primarily international. In a way, CS Rio was a form for us to recognize ourselves as Brazilians in a game. We were used to video games, yeah, but Brazilian imagery was not something often found in them. The question about the representation of a Brazilian identity emphasizes this map's role in Brazilian video games cultural history. With a decrease in technology's prices through the 2000s due to the injection of foreign capital in Brazil's telecom market, the decade of 2000 saw the rise of broadband services and the growing support of players to games that no longer depended on LAN houses. Well, even Counter-Strike was taken home, if I may say that. But on these games, they relied on personal processing power and bandwidth. This sudden growth was a moment of transition, one in which the notion of having a career in esports was finally becoming tangible. The launch of League of Legends in 2009 advanced the market significantly. Even with no Riot offices in Brazil, the game was an instant hit in the country. Players all through Brazil were used to playing Dota, Defense of the Ancients, and League of Legends felt like the next best thing. At that moment, though, Brazilian players played the game with a much higher latency than that experienced in places where there was formal Riot representation. Riot coming to Brazil in 2012 and launching a national server boosted the ever-expanding League of Legends gaming community. The company did not solve the problems, however. Riot had promised a Brazilian server to decrease the game's latency to 10 milliseconds, but positioned the server in Miami, in the United States. Not cool. Putting the latency around 130 milliseconds. This condition persists in the country today, considering some locations. it's not there, it's not here all the time, but considering some locations which have low broadband services. Brazilian researcher Tarcísio Macedo discusses, for example, the notion of geographies of esports to address these incongruities within the Brazilian territory. For example, Macedo reports that in the southern and southeastern regions, latency rarely exceeds 30 milliseconds in a proper connection, while in the northern region, latency is usually between 90 and 150 milliseconds. This precarious condition does not allow most Brazil players who are not in São Paulo or Rio de Janeiro to maximize their competitive efforts. The players who wish to become professionals need to migrate. The localized version's release boosted the community's spirits, impacting its directly to its growth, to the point that still in 2012, Riot created the Brazilian League of Legends Championship, Campeonato Brasileiro League of Legends CBLOL, the main competition of the game in Brazil. 10 teams play in 2 annual splits in the CBLOL, 1 split per semester. These splits are worth the classification for the game's international competitions entrance phase, the mid-season invitational, and the League of Legends World Championship. The history of CBLOL is the story of how mass media began paying attention to esports in the country. The championship was the first to offer a significant award, still in 2012. $80,000. The amount itself captured the media's attention, which then transitioned to a rhetoric of video games were no longer unproductive toys. They were becoming sports where you could compete for the grand prize. So now they were valuable. There was still no perception of professionalism, though, in the media, of course, to the point where the media would say that anyone interested in competing the CBLOL could compete for that amount. 2015 was a pivotal year, the year in which the mass media finally expressed their interest in esports. A more professional understanding of the field replaced most amateur business models. Teams were institutionalized, becoming companies that negotiated sponsorship and, more importantly, transmission rights. ESPN was the first broadcaster to embrace the phenomenon, starting coverage through its networks in September 2015. Its interests were broad and included League of Legends, Counter-Strike, Global Offensive, and other more traditional games. But they also followed closely games that simulate traditional sports, FIFA, NBA 2K, and Madden NFL, for example. ESPN spent almost 2 years undisputed as the only broadcaster to cover esports in Brazil. Only in 2017 did Sport TV, a local channel belonging to Rede Globo, the largest media conglomerate in Brazil, began investing in esports coverage. The event that made mass media look at esports for good was the finals of the Brazilian Championship of League of Legends CBLOL in 2015, which happened in one of the largest and most modern arenas of Brazilian soccer, Allianz Parque. In addition to the attendance of 12,000 people, Riot also transmitted the broadcast of the matches to 44 movie theaters throughout Brazil, which had their tickets sold out. This event was a pivotal point in the history of sports in Brazil because the mass media attention was enough to even to reframe the way esports were covered. It became the standard to transform the coverage of esports and take it closer to the traditional show you see when you watch a soccer match or a Formula One race. Still, this relationship raises a question about how this scenario is structured. Video games in Brazil are targets of mass media attention. They have been structured in recent years as a very culturally rich scenario and in open economic growth. But that penetration in the Brazilian scenario can still be considered a niche. First, because the coverage of esports only has real appeal in the less commercially relevant age groups between 10 and 20 years old. Second, even video games, more broadly, are a domain misunderstood by the Brazilian population. Thus, as much as media corporations pay attention to the phenomenon, its mass media breakthrough is mitigated by a social misunderstanding related to the fact that access to technology and the access to technology and its culture are sparse in Brazil. This, on the first point, the New Zoo Sports Bar survey pointed to this trend of transformation, stating, as I said before, that a large part of esports fans in Brazil do not even follow the country's soccer championships. Historically, this is a significant change if we consider that soccer is structured not only as mass entertainment in Brazil, but as a meaningful part of its cultural experience. Brazilian soccer is part of the country's identity, and this identity dimension changed in two distinct ways. First, by transforming the experience of soccer in the experience of globalized intellectual properties. So we watch League of Legends, not soccer anymore. Well, some of us, of course. Then, and already introducing the second point, as soccer clubs invest in esports, exploring their relationships of belonging and community creation at the same time as they explore other marketing dimensions. Brazilian soccer teams have been watching the esports field with attention for some time now. Flamengo, one of the largest soccer clubs in Brazil, was the first to invest in the phenomenon by creating an esports division in 2017. Flamengo, which has a League of Legends team that secured a vice championship in this year's first split, has just announced that it is preparing to start competing in Free Fire. This fact is an exceptional sign that esports is getting closer and closer to the world of sports. This same approach has been followed by many other Brazilian soccer clubs, Santos, Cruzeiro, and Corinthians, that have been exploring this relationship, even investing in an audience that is not affectionate to soccer, is not passionate enough to soccer. Within the clubs mentioned, Corinthians stands out for its impressive track record. As a result of an agreement with Immortals Gaming Club, which is also, as I said before, also responsible for Made in Brazil, MBR. Corinthians launched in 2019 its esports division with a team dedicated to the game Free Fire, which grows significantly in Brazil, rivaling both CSGO and League of Legends. Corinthians also happened to win the Brazilian League of Free Fire in 2019. They created that team in that year, and they won the Brazilian League of Free Fire in the same year. This relationship between soccer and esports should occur naturally in Brazil because of its apparent relationship with the sport. In May of this year, in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic, Rede Globo created a show called Futebol de Casa, Soccer from Home, in which famous soccer players played a Pro Evolution Soccer tournament from their homes. It was okay, but it didn't really have traction. This construction tried to replace the suspended soccer schedules on television, which were on hold because of the social isolation measures. Still, even with the exposure in the mass media, games inspired by sports cannot overcome or even come close to the most traditional esports. The Brazilian market still responds much more vividly to CSGO, League of Legends, and more recently, Valorant. The point of divergence in the Brazilian market, and which is in line with everything discussed so far, is that Free Fire, Garena's Battle Royale, has grown significantly, even rivaling the leaders in this leaderboard, League of Legends and Counter-Strike, on the national scene. There are several compelling points about this fact. However, the most productive of these is that in a country with more than half of its population identifying as black and that exhibits worrying poverty and high social vulnerability rates, a game that reaches below the poverty line has a commercial advantage over other games. Thus, the fact that the leaders in Brazil esports market, League of Legends and CS, and the games that refer to traditional sports, FIFA and PES, for example, demand specific material conditions, ends up favoring the propagation of Free Fire. Garena's Battle Royale is a game that runs reasonably well, even on an average cell phone, and that reaches layers of the populational distribution and the Brazilian geography that do not have the minimum condition to acquire a computer or a console. And that is why Free Fire is so successful in Brazil, because it aims at being playable for everyone. If we consider the most played esports in Brazil, our understanding of the sports scene will be biased. In my opinion, to follow only League of Legends or Counter-Strike or even Hearthstone and Valorant would be to render an understanding of Brazil centered on neoliberal dynamics that emulate a Western and North-centric esports scene. Instead, a closer look at Free Fire offers comprehension of the interactions between this massive country and esports. Not only because it is hegemonic in the mobile scenario, both in the number of players and downloads, but because Garena itself reported that Free Fire was the mobile game that profited the most in Brazil in 2019. Free Fire offers a fascinating context for inquiry because a player does not need a powerful mobile phone to run it from a strict materialist perspective. For a scenario like the whole of the Western world, perhaps this dimension is not relevant. Although, if we consider the economic conditions under which the global South countries operate, it is impossible not to contemplate an audience that wants to play. However, it simply cannot because of the pernicious economic dynamics perpetuated by the video games industry. Free Fire enables a type of consumption that arrives in every corner of the country, both in its geographical sense, considering the less central regions, north and northeast, and in the sense of the social class. Three particular points are involving in this insight. First, it is no coincidence that Corinthians has invested in an esports division. Corinthians is a soccer club known for its ties to poverty. It comes mainly from the east zone of São Paulo, a historically socially vulnerable region. The club's main objective with its esports division has fallen on Free Fire. The relationship between the affection of the fans and the populist aspect of the choice is visible here. Corinthians, in 1 year of existence, secured its place as LBFF, the Brazilian League of Free Fire, champion. Only recently, Flamengo, another big club in Brazil, only recently Flamengo declared it is finally hiring Free Fire players. This dynamic, which alludes to a favela ethos, is also extended to players and streamers hired by the clubs. Settle, which was considered Brazilian Streamer of the Year in 2019, came from a vulnerable area in Rio de Janeiro and started working at 11 years old in a parking lot. Serol is also a dropout of high school. Nobru, Free Fire's biggest star in Brazil, and that was considered MVP in the 2019 World Championship, also comes from a similar background. Level Up, another member of the team, the same. There is something like an idea of authenticity, a fable of victory that is incredibly seductive for the population's precarious layers. The second point concerns that Free Fire is considered a game for the poor in Brazil. Last October, Garina announced with the organization Central Única das Favelas, CUFA, a tournament named Taça das Favelas, which means Slum Cup, which seeks to engage players throughout Brazil, making the game even more inclusive and diverse. The Taça das Favelas Cup is the first tournament explicitly organized for the periphery public. It is a nod to the homonymous Taça das Favelas Cup, a soccer tournament that revealed several players that later were welcomed by the leading clubs in Brazilian soccer. There's much here to reflect upon. This is a tournament that seeks inclusion, that attempts to unmake the invisible hierarchies structured in general esports scene. It shows that Garina recognizes its specific fan base and makes a move that should help seize further the market. This tournament also has a previous background, which means Garina profits from previous social capital, and it helps fan the speculations that it might pursue other actions like this. Finally, the third point highlights that this stratification also reveals veiled social dynamics in the most populated esports. The fact that Free Fire is incredibly accessible implies that it arrives much more efficiently for the Brazilian black population. This condition ends up naturally making states of difference emerge. It is not surprising, then, that we find demonstrations of racism against professional players. The recurrence of black people playing Free Fire is much greater than in other esports. And this condition activates social dynamics rooted in the Brazilian social life and that end up appearing in the scene of esports. Now that we have a brief knowledge of the Brazilian esports scene, I will discuss how the research in esports has been structuring. Then I will speak a little about the themes catching my attention, figuring as central objects of my research. Science in Brazil has seen better days, and I am sure some of you have heard. Unlike the Western world, science in Brazil is financed almost exclusively by the state. If we talk about social sciences, and I am particularly in the field of media and communication, the situation is dire. Not only is there no funding for social science, but they are also considered unimportant by the government structure at work. Our National Council for Research, which we call CNPq, has restricted funding to what they understand as strategic areas. These all relate to considerations about applied technologies. The social sciences in Brazil have been withering for the last 4 years. Maybe some of you wonder what the state of game studies is, therefore, in Brazil. The answer, straightforward, is they do not exist. We are but a handful of researchers spread over some separate areas and completely without funding. And this is no overstatement. The discussion I brought earlier, which problematizes the fact that video games are considered a children's activity, also applies to our funding agencies, which do not recognize video game research's value. One of the most important domains of contemporary culture, and one incredibly exciting and with practical applications in Brazil, has been systematically neglected. As far as our discussion here is concerned, the result of this lack of policies is that a survey in the database of the agency responsible for the graduate studies in the country reveals only, and I kid you not, 8 monographic works, all of them master's theses. No doctoral work specifically dedicated to the subject of esports was found in this research. I know for a fact that there's one that was just recently defended, but it's still not in the database. But still, it's one. There are some works, articles above all, dedicated to the theme, published in Brazilian academic journals. However, it is still alarming how rare is the systematic scientific research on this subject in Brazil. Perhaps the most remarkable inconsistency in this case is the fact that the few policies to encourage research in video games are aimed at their production. We do not have an industry of video games, but the government puts money in research and production research, and not in their understanding as media and its effects. That said, my group's research agenda observes the effects of social dynamics resulting from the consumption and appropriation of esports in Brazil, particularly how material circumstances prescribe social interactions. This position is relatively new, considering how long I have been in dialogue with game studies. I like to think I dabble in game studies since 2007, when I started pursuing my academic career. But the shift dates from 2016. And it stems from the problems I have explored through this lecture. This shift is also a problem with little to do with actual game studies, being much more closely related to social and political conditions framing academia in Brazil. For some time, there was no research on game studies in Brazil, which led us to believe we had to establish a dialogue with the academia abroad. By doing that, we overlooked crucial parts of our culture and how we were appropriating video games. So this is a problem we're trying to address right now. There is a Brazilian gamer culture, and there is a need for Brazilian game studies. This understanding of consumption and the effects of appropriation of video games in Brazil demands an investigation in the material conditions that articulate the phenomenon. This position seeks to advance the understanding of play in the Brazilian context, considering it an essential key to understanding Brazilian society. For me, the root of this understanding appears in the dimension of what I call the colonization of play. The dynamics of late capitalism, neoliberalism, have captured the playful impulse, the very condition of creation. This phenomenon shapes how we experience entertainment, how we relate to consumer franchises, and finally, how we play video games. Be it the growing use of gamification and gamification strategies on platforms, the surge of gachas, and the trade of loot box, the traces of this pernicious construction are countless. The hypothesis that underlies my research is that this phenomenon is more effective in contexts vulnerable to neoliberal exploitation. This hypothesis argues that technical arrangements designed for exploiting players are much more efficient in underdeveloped countries. This perception is governed by the comprehension of Brazil's social, political, and economic dynamics. However, it also considers the rhetoric of technique because media literacy conditions in the country are generally below expectations. Thus, I have looked at the relationship between esports and Brazilian society from three specific axes, each related to the rise of political and neoliberal ethos and how they took control of society processes related to the phenomenon of play. This argument initiates with one of the most notorious issues related to the understanding of the colonization of play, play's contraposition to work. Neoliberal has been instrumental in transforming play into work, and this project is visible both in the technical aspect and the abstract character of play. We observe both of these characteristics by tying game design's material implications to the social scenes formed through play. Our work on card games, Hearthstone namely, was instrumental in leading us through to the political view of the field. The other important aspect of this dichotomy is the one concerned with seeking work in game industry. In Brazil, where there is no competitive game industry or even a strong presence of the corporations, we observe how people pursue jobs in this informal market with particular attention to informal work. This discussion points to the fact that esports in Brazil do not have a regulated infrastructure. Unlike other countries, such as South Korea, for example, in which the government has interceded with the creation of agencies and policies to shape esport practices. In one way or another, we observe seeing the mobilized amateur and professional players, streamers, social media, commentators, psychologists, technicians, and all sorts of professionals without a defined work regulation. In August, the Brazilian Public Ministry of Labor showed interest in understanding these relationships because legal processes originating from these relationships began to emerge, but that wasn't pursued yet. The judiciary power itself still does not have many clues on how to behave. As I write these lines, one of the most important journalistic shows in Brazil, it's a news outlet show, has just broadcast a report on the relationship between dreams and job insecurity in esports. People from several teams in Brazil living in, terrible conditions. Therefore, the relationship between esports and informal work is one of my research group's priorities, but it's not the only one. One of the things that interest me in this observation of how play relates to Brazil's social issues is understanding how territorial dimensions imply particular relationships. As I said earlier, Brazil's regions are continental, and the center of representativeness and infrastructure is the southeastern region. The point is that with initiatives like the Taça das Favelas Cup and the growth of games like Free Fire, other regions of Brazil can finally compete with the cultural conditions and they are so centralized in the southern and southeastern regions of the country. This interaction is permeated by cultural hierarchies and power relations that date back to centuries of Brazilian history. It also opens space for a consideration that has already been predicted. We must focus on race issues within Brazil's esports. First, because there is still a discrepancy between technology, access to technology, and race in the country. And secondly, because this Brazilian social and cultural condition is represented in several observed interactions, and it seems to be structural to the scene. Finally, my intention in this lecture was to offer a general overview of Brazil esports, one that would discuss aspects of the scene in the way it is organized and observe trends and players and contemplate the social distinctions involved in creating this context. Understanding the Brazilian esports scene as an extension of its social and political aspects is valuable because it allows us to access voices and places of resistance as they stand without accidentally hiding them under the smoke and mirrors of market research or mass media channels. The growth of esports in Brazil is part fairy tale, part cautionary tale. Along with them also grows the urgency to understand the arrangements created by this context. The esports scene in Brazil thrives against all odds. Thank you, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.